The nights were short and fear prowled the streets. No one knew whose turn it would be tomorrow, and everyone had only one question: who is the killer? If you like this style of true crime, don't forget to like and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next episodes. Charles Raymond Starkweather was born on November 24, 1938, in Lincoln, Nebraska, USA. He was the third of 7 children of Guy and Helen Starkweather and didn't have an easy life from a young age. The Starkweather family was working class. Charles's father was sometimes a carpenter, but due to rheumatoid arthritis, his hands were always out of work, and Helen worked as a waitress to feed her children. The only source of family income was Helen's job, and for this reason, the Starkweather family always struggled with economic problems and poverty. The children could never have the things they wanted, didn't eat good food, had no toys, their clothes were always old, and they were mocked by other children. There are no good memories or positive points from Charles Starkweather's school years, and if I were to describe Charles's school years in 3 words, they would be harassment, torment, and mockery. Charles was born with a mild congenital defect that caused his legs to be bowed, and this was one of the biggest reasons other children at school made fun of him. They gave him insulting nicknames and said inappropriate things about his legs. Charles also had a stutter as a child and was tormented a lot for not being able to speak well. As time passed and Charles grew up, his bowed legs became less noticeable, and his stuttering was also gone. Charles realized that he liked sports, and sports were one of the few things that made him feel superior. This is how the teenage Charles joined high school sports clubs, and after he made a name for himself in sports at school, he started getting revenge on the people who had mocked him before. He mistreated anyone he didn't like, started fights, and felt nothing but anger inside him. This is how Charles Starkweather turned from one of the most well-behaved teenagers in the community into one of the most troublesome. One of his high school friends said about Charles Starkweather, "Charles could be the kindest person you've ever seen. If he liked you, he would do anything for you. He was a funny and cool person and made sure you had a good time when you were with him. But he had another side. He could be extremely mean and cruel. If he saw a poor guy on the street who was bigger than him, wore better clothes, was prettier and richer, he would turn that person's life into hell. He would torment the person so much until they seemed less valuable than himself." Due to his inappropriate behavior, Charles couldn't finish high school and was expelled. According to reports from his parents and siblings, even his family was afraid of his violent temper. Finally, when Charles was 18, he had a car accident with his father's car and, because he was at fault, his father had to pay a large sum to repair both cars. This accident led to a big fight between Charles and his father, and in the end, his father threw the 18-year-old Charles out and told him he had no right to return home. At this time, Charles found a job as a guard in a large warehouse, which happened to be near a middle school. A 13-year-old girl named Carol Ann Fugate was studying at this school. Carol was born on July 30, 1943, and lived with her mother and stepfather. She also had an older sister, who was the girlfriend of one of Charles's close friends. Through this close friend, Charles and Carol met, and despite their 5-year age difference and the fact that Carol was only 13, they started a relationship. Carol was in love with Charles, and Charles also liked this 13-year-old girl very much. Around the time Charles and Carol had just started their relationship, Charles resigned from his job at the warehouse and was hired as a garbage collector. His new job gave him the opportunity to search people's homes for theft and earn some money this way. It was also at this exact time that Charles Starkweather decided he wanted to become a criminal, because he concluded that all dead people were on the same level, and none of them could be better than him. At the age of 18, while spending his days as a garbage collector and thief, Charles would constantly curse at strangers, yelling at them and saying, "Go to hell." On the evening of November 30 to December 1, 1957, Charles Starkweather turned from an antisocial teenager into a murderous criminal. Robert Colvert, 21, was a young man who had recently been discharged from the U.S. Navy and worked at a gas station in November 957. A year before, he had married his high school girlfriend, and both were expecting their first child. On the night of November 30, Robert was on his night shift at the gas station when Charles came to the gas station. Right next to the gas pump, there was a small kiosk where Robert also sold products. In the small kiosk inside the gas station, there were also some stuffed dolls for sale, and upon seeing these dolls, Charles decided to buy one for his girlfriend, Caril. He picked up a doll and told Robert he didn't have the money with him now but would bring the money for the doll later. Naturally, Robert did not agree and said he couldn't sell anything on credit. Charles put the doll back and left the gas station in anger, but a few hours later, he returned with a shotgun. Around 3 a.m. on the first day of December, Charles Starkweather entered the gas station with a shotgun in his hand. He stole $100 from the kiosk's cash register and then, threatening Robert Colvert, forced him into his car. He drove to a remote location. Robert knew that if he sat still and did nothing, he might lose his life, so he started fighting with Charles. Their fight started with an argument and then turned into a physical fight. Robert was literally fighting for his life and even wounded himself during the fight, but Charles became more and more violent and finally put the shotgun to Robert Colvert's head and pulled the trigger. After sunrise, Charles dumped Robert's body in a large farm field and then went to a store. With 10 of the money he had stolen from the gas station, he bought a set of used clothes and threw away his bloody items. Charles was neither scared nor did he feel guilty. Instead, a sense of power had overwhelmed his entire being. This sense of power made him think he had a new reason to live, a motivation that pushed him toward killing people. Charles's first murder, finding his motivation for life, and turning 19 all happened in 1 week. Charles Starkweather told Carol about the robbery and murder of Robert shortly after the crime, and this 13-year-old girl cared more about her love and affection for Charles than about the death of a human being. The police found Robert's body, and given that his head was practically exploded by a gunshot and the body was found in a farm field, they assumed that Robert had been killed by a passing person, and finding the killer was almost impossible. Because of this, no specific investigation was carried out on his case, and no extensive search was conducted. The feeling of power that Charles had after the first murder continued until January 1958, when on Tuesday, January 21, 1958, Charles Starkweather was fired from his job. That same day, he went to Carol's house and looked for his girlfriend, but Carol was at school. Carol's stepfather, Marion Bartlett, 57, along with Carol's mother, Velda Bartlett, 36, and her 2-year-old daughter, Betty Jean, were home. And none of them paid attention to Charles's noises as he searched for Carol. Carol's stepfather and mother practically hated Charles and had told their daughter many times to stay away from him, and Carol had apparently lied to them that she no longer had any relationship with Charles. Charles became angry at the indifference of Carol's stepfather and mother and attacked them with a shotgun. He first killed Marion and Velda with gunshots to the head and then repeatedly struck the skull of the 2-year-old Betty Jean with the gun. He then hid the bodies behind the house and waited for Carol to arrive. Of course, it is necessary to know that there are 2 different narratives from Carol and Charles. According to Carol, she was at school when her family members were killed and arrived home after the murders. But Charles claimed that Carol was present at the house during the murders and was inside the house the entire time her family was being killed. We will take Carol's words as a document because we know this 13-year-old girl definitely went to school that day. According to Caril's statements, Charles told her that he had taken her family members hostage, and if Caril cooperated with him, they would be safe, but if she wanted to oppose, all her family members would be killed. Carol accepted, and the couple stayed at the family's house for 6 days, and according to Charles, they lived a royal life. But over time, Carol's grandmother and relatives became worried. Carol told them all that the family had influenza and could not communicate with anyone. She wrote this on a note and stuck it to the back of their front door. She also signed the note with Miss Bartlett and underlined it twice. Carol later claimed that the Miss Bartlett at the end of her note was a plea for help because her own last name was not Bartlett, and the only Miss Bartlett in the family was her 2-year-old sister, and she couldn't read or write. In short, in the end, Kirill's grandmother became very worried and told them that if she didn't hear from her family members, she would contact the police. Finally, this police threat caused Charles and Carol to leave the house and get out of that area before being arrested by the authorities. The two of them got in the car and initially had no specific destination, but after wandering on intercity roads for a while, they went to the house of one of Carol's family friends. This house was in the middle of a large farm and belonged to 70-year-old August Meyer. August lived alone with his dog in the town of Bennett, Nebraska. Unfortunately, immediately after entering August's house, Charles killed both him and his dog with a shotgun. To be more precise, he shot August and then killed his dog with multiple blows from the shotgun. He beat the poor dog so hard that the wooden part of the gun broke. Carol later said that after seeing Charles's violent behavior toward August's dog, she realized that disobeying this man would not have good consequences and could cost her her life. They stayed at August's house for a few days and finally got back in their car and hit the road. Somewhere in the middle of their journey, they took a dirt road, and the car got stuck in the mud. Charles and Carol abandoned the car there and walked to the main road. They stood on the side of the road for a while until two teenagers, Robert Jensen, 17, and Carol King, 16, stopped to give them a ride. Charles gave these two the address of an abandoned warehouse in Bennett to drop them off, and Robert Jensen accepted. After reaching the location, Charles suddenly shot Robert in the head and killed the 17-year-old boy. Charles shot Robert a total of 6 times. He then tried to rape Carol King, but when he saw that Carol was very resistant, he became angry and took the life of the 16-year-old girl with a gunshot. Charles Starkweather claimed that Carol was the one who killed Carol King because she was jealous when she saw Charles paying attention to the girl. But Kirill stated in her confessions that during the entire time Charles was killing Robert and Carol, she was sitting in the car and did not move from her place. After killing these two teenagers, Charles and Carol stole Robert Jensen's car and fled the crime scene. They then drove toward the wealthy part of Lincoln. The plan was to find a suitable house where they could rest for a few hours and then hit the road again. Exactly on January 28, 1958, the young couple entered the house of C. Lauer Ward, 47, and Clara Ward, 46. C. Lauer was a wealthy industrialist and lived in a large and luxurious house with his wife Clara, their 14-year-old son Michael, and their 51-year-old maid, Lillian Fenkel. Charles and Carol entered this family's house. They went to the deaf maid's room and, after tying her hands and feet, rested for a while. After a few hours of sleep, they slaughtered Lillian with a knife. Then they went to Clara and struck her neck and chest with the same knife. A few hours later, C. Lauer came home and was immediately shot and killed as soon as he stepped inside the house. Before Charles and Carol left the Ward family's house, they broke the neck of the family dog and stole their jewelry. Charles later told the police that he had tied Lillian to the bed and was throwing a knife at her, but in the end, it was Kirill who killed the woman. In short, they killed 3 members of the house and, before the family's 14-year-old son Michael returned home from school, they hit the road again. The plan was to go from Nebraska to Washington State and visit Charles's brother. Michael Ward found the bodies of his mother, father, and Lillian, and with the case being publicized, it was on the news everywhere. The police searched every inch of the house to find the killer and searched all the blocks in the area to see if they could find any clues. Unfortunately, no evidence was found, but a few of the neighbors had seen Charles and Carol and reported their physical descriptions to the police. And since the news of the murders was being publicized one after another and these cases had started with the murder of Carol's parents, the police very soon concluded that the killer of the Ward family was probably Charles Starkweather. That is, it can almost be said that they knew who the killer was. They just had to arrest him. When the news of the case's publicity reached Charles, he immediately found a traveling salesman named Merle Collison, 37, on the side of the road. Merle was sleeping in his car. Charles tapped on the window, and when Merle woke up, he asked him to get out of the car and give them the key. Before Merle could even object or say a word, he was killed by Charles and Carol. According to Caril, it was Charles who shot Merle, but Charles himself claimed that Caril had shot the man 9 times. The car seemed to have a problem because instead of starting and hitting the road again, Charles opened the hood to start the car. Meanwhile, a motorcyclist named Joe Sprinkle passed by them, and Charles asked the man to help them. Joe agreed, but while working, he noticed Collison's body, which was lying under the car seats. Before he could say a word, Charles pointed the gun at him and tried to shoot Joe, but fortunately, Joe's height and build were bigger, and the distance between them was very short. Joe Sprinkle, with a little fighting, managed to take the gun from Charles, and at that exact moment, the Natrona County Deputy Sheriff passed by them. The Deputy Sheriff got out of his car when he saw this scene, but before he could get closer, Caril ran toward him and yelled, "He's going to kill me. He's crazy. He just killed a man." Charles, who was now unarmed, upon hearing Carol's words, jumped into their previous car, which belonged to the Ward family, and drove at high speed toward the city of Douglas. The deputy sheriff took Carol into his car and immediately reported the presence of Charles Starkweather to all forces in the area. The news of Starkweather's escape spread like a bomb in the city, and all intercity roads of Douglas were closed. Then, during a long chase, police forces managed to stop Charles's car, which was moving at a speed of 160 kilometers per hour. Just imagine, several police cars were chasing him at high speed, and they were shooting at his car's tires and windows from inside the cars to stop him. Finally, with a bullet hitting the rear window of Starkweather's car, he pressed his foot hard on the brake, and the car stopped. More than 10 police officers with their guns pointed at Charles gathered around the car, and Charles Starkweather was sitting behind the wheel without saying a word. Why did he brake? When the rear window of the car was shattered by a police bullet, a piece of glass hit the back of Starkweather's ear and his right hand at high speed, and Charles thought he had been shot. He was sure he had been shot in the side of the head and was going to die soon. That's why he stopped and hoped that the police might save him. The cold and indifferent killer, who did not value people's lives at all, seemed to love life so much that when he realized he might face death, he surrendered himself. The next day, on January 29, 1958, Charles Starkweather stood before a judge and was accused of the murder of Merle Collison. Then, on January 31, Charles was returned to Nebraska for his main trial to begin. The date was set for May, and with the start of the court sessions, Charles's lawyers presented an insanity defense. Charles Starkweather strongly disagreed with this, saying without a doubt that he was mentally sound. On May 23, 1958, Charles was found guilty of the murder of Robert Jensen and was sentenced to death. He initially said that he had kidnapped Carol and that the girl had no connection to the murders, but then he changed his story several times and finally, on the day of the trial, he testified against Caril and said that some of the murders had been committed by Caril. Carol said from the very first moment that Charles had forced her to come with him by threatening her family and that she now wanted to go to her mother. It seemed she was completely unaware of the murder of her family members and knew nothing. One of the case judges said he believed Carol was lying and had many opportunities to escape. She knew about everything but cooperated with Charles due to her young age and ignorance. Charles also said over and over that if he was going to be executed, Carol should also be executed because she was as guilty as Charles in this case. Charles Starkweather could only be convicted of the murder of Robert Jensen, and on May 23, 1958, he received the death penalty for this conviction. The 20-year-old Charles sat in the electric chair at the Nebraska State Penitentiary at 12:04 a.m. on June 25, 1959, and was executed. Exactly half an hour before the execution, the doctor who was supposed to declare Charles dead had a heart attack and died. This was really random. Charles Starkweather did not utter any last words and remained silent. But before the execution, he wrote a letter to his parents and said, "But Dad, I'm not sorry for what I did because for the first time, Carol and I had more fun." According to reports, after his death sentence was announced, He had no special feeling about death and was completely indifferent to it. It was as if he had accepted his fate and knew that no matter what reaction he showed, he was going to be executed in the electric chair and die. Carol was convicted as an accessory to the crime, and on November 21, 1958, she received a life sentence with the possibility of parole. Carol had just turned 15 when she entered prison and stayed in prison for 18 years. Finally, in June 1976, after serving 18 years, she was released from the Nebraska Center for Women's Corrections in York. She had very good behavior in prison, and that's why she was released so soon. Otherwise, she would have had to serve more than 25 years. Many films have been inspired by this case, numerous books have been written, and a lot of songs have been made. Carol Fugate married in 2007, and 6 years later, she and her husband had a car accident. Unfortunately, her husband died instantly, but Carol survived with serious injuries. Carol is currently 81 years old, is still alive, and lives in Michigan, USA. The biggest question about Carol is why she didn't escape when she had the chance. According to her, when Charles was killing Robert Jensen and Carol King in an abandoned warehouse, Carol was sitting alone in the car. Why didn't she try to escape? Why didn't she run away on foot? Or, for example, in Lincoln, Charles and Carol took turns sleeping to be aware of the situation. Why didn't she try to escape when Charles was sleeping? Did she really have a role in the murders, or was she a victim? Carol herself says she didn't do anything, but pay attention. There is no living person who can confirm or deny her words. Carol Fugate might be an innocent 13 or 14-year-old teenager who was taken hostage by a killer, or she might be a ruthless killer who is just good at acting. What do you think?